we can learn a lot about a culture from their bathroom habits. Super popular philosopher Slavoj Žižek argues that the different toilets of Europe tell us something about each of those countries. But then what can we learn from the ancients, where the vast majority of people didn't even have toilets? At that time, some people, if they were lucky, had a chamber pot to poop in. They'd collect all the day's waste, then dump it later in a river or even at the end of the street. But most people just squatted outside and did their business in the open world. And if they didn't use toilets, you best believe they didn't use toilet paper. The Romans would use this, a shared community sponge on a stick that they'd wipe with. Equally gross and depressing side note, Roman writer Seneca retells a horrific story about a gladiator that kills himself by choking on one of these. The ancient Greeks even had a proverb for frugality, which translates roughly as 3 stones are enough to wipe one's butt. What can we learn from these people of primitive pooping patterns? We seem to be so different today. The Greek playwright Aristophanes, the man we learned about last episode for his bashing of our philosophy hero Socrates, wrote a play called Assemblywomen. The play is mostly remembered for having the largest word in all of literature. But in an equally ridiculous part, a character squats down and poops openly on the stage. It's hard to see why Aristophanes put this in the play, other than the simple reason that, like the dozens of other instances of poop humor in his work, he simply just thought it was funny. Maybe we aren't so different from ancient Greeks after all. This is the timeline of Western philosophy. Hi everyone, my name is Brad, and I will be your philosophical sensei in this knowledge dojo of Western philosophy. In this episode, we're going to cover a group of thinkers known as the Pre-Socratics. These guys are responsible for a lot of the main ideas that kind of get the tradition started. So let's just jump right into it. Where are we on the timeline, and how did we get here? Of course, these thinkers didn't think of themselves as pre-Socratic any more than they thought they were pre-Jesus, or pre-sliced bread, or pre-anything, really. You see, what had happened was, Western civilization eventually reached a point where man had both enough leisure time to think, and also the materials needed to write those thoughts down. You can imagine some of these thoughts are pretty out there. I mean, these men did wipe their butts with rocks after all. But the all-important question, as always, is why should you even care? When I was first getting into philosophy, these pre-Socratic thinkers were always a bore. Who really cares about what these guys thought? I mean, they used to drink the sweat of athletes as medicine, for Christ's sake. Let's just skip these guys and start with Plato, where it begins to at least make a little bit of sense. I'd then go read my favorite philosophers and would be so puzzled as to why they kept referring to these earlier thinkers. But the deeper I went into philosophy, the more interesting these dudes became. Yes, they are pretty wrong about many things. But the questions they asked and the strategies they used are lasting to this day. The seeds of every major philosophy begin here. If we want to have a better idea of what philosophy is, maybe the best place to start is with the first geniuses to ask the important questions, even if they pooped in buckets. So let's go back, way back to ancient Greece, to the land known as Ionia. It's here where our first thinkers take a stab at what the ultimate nature of reality is. First, there's Thales, who had a major breakthrough. What if everything in the world were composed of one single substance? He wasn't so much philosophizing as he was trying to produce an early form of science. He hypothesized that all the world was composed of water, ice, cloud, people, it's all just water reorganized. Even a rock is a type of liquid that just hardened. It's obvious that he was wrong. But think about how clever he must have been to think of that in a time when everyone just assumed that nature was a whim of the gods. He took the limited knowledge he had about the world and constructed a theory that tried to make sense of it. Knowing everything you know, try to invent an explanation for the entire world. It's not so easy. One of his pupils, Anaximander, started to chip away at the water theory. He noticed if all was water, then how could there possibly be any differences in the world? If everything is water, then how does this water create all these new things? There must be something more primitive or primal than water. Anaximander refers to this something as the unbounded or the limitless, a kind of invisible force before all things which everything arises out of, and into which they once more pass away. These two, as well as a few other Ionians, were trying to get a grasp on the true nature of reality. In philosophy, we have a term for this field of study. We call it metaphysics. This word is quite a mouthful, so we've brought some extra flair in to help keep our definition interesting. However, due to a recent dispute with Disney's legal team, I must insist that the following is protected under fair use. Definitions, but with lightsabers. The term metaphysics comes from two Greek words which translate roughly to after or behind or among the study of the natural. Okay, so that's just trading one mouthful for another. Just think of meta as meaning about or before. Metaphysics is what physics is about, or what comes before it. What is actually here and going on? And what is that something even like? Is it even a something? Today, metaphysics is sometimes passed on for just literal physics. In any other age, Einstein's ideas about matter, gravity, and light would be much more metaphysical sounding than scientific. But metaphysics hasn't really gone anywhere. It just might be a little deeper down there. For instance, Einstein says E equals mc squared. So energy is equal to matter times the speed of light squared. Okay, that's great. But what's energy? Einstein showed the relationship between the two things, energy and matter, but what's beyond the relationship? There was another Ionian who came after Thales and Anaximander. He, like his predecessors, hoped to solve some of the puzzles before him. His name was Heraclitus. Heraclitus has several nicknames, such as the Weeping Philosopher and the Obscure. Unlike most thinkers, Heraclitus didn't really see much of a problem with contradiction. To him, the world is a set of contradictions. The way up and the way down is one and the same. The world is both many and one. All of this shakes out, in his opinion, because ultimately the world is in constant flux, in a state of becoming. To him, the world is an ever-living fire. There's some debate on how literal Heraclitus was being here, but the element of fire fit as a better metaphor for him than that of water. The concept of a never-ending fire has a way of synthesizing the thinking from before. Thales thought the world was one substance, water. Anaximander disagreed, thinking it was this boundless thing outside the elements. Heraclitus progressed and blended these two thoughts into fire as this boundless, ever-changing force, the force of the world in both being and becoming. But this is all some pretty heady stuff, so it's probably best we take a quick mental break with our cute animal intermission.
Two over there. one beneath us. And Fred here, who's making quite a good
Next up, we have probably the biggest hitter yet. This man, Pythagoras, was something of a rock star of his time. You probably know him for his famous theory of triangles called Pythagorean theorem. But for his contemporaries, Pythagoras was a much bigger deal. He was very charismatic and led a sort of religious movement and developed a cult of followers. You've probably heard about some wacky cults in the modern day, but the Pythagorean crew might top it. They had a set of community rules which were pretty odd. Among some of those rules were 1. Do not urinate facing the sun. 2. Do not have swallows in the house.
A swallow?
And finally, 3. Do not consume beans, since flatulence is spiritually disturbing. It's pretty depressing to think that the guy who came up with those rules is way smarter than most of us. His breakthroughs in mathematics spilled over into his metaphysics, whereas the Ionians thought that the true nature of the world was from a universal substance, something like water or fire. Pythagoras believed the ultimate nature of reality was mathematical. It's not quite clear exactly how this would all shake out, but the idea was definitely influential, even to this day. Further west on the Mediterranean were a group of thinkers known as the Eleatics, named for their home in what is now modern-day Italy. Chief among these thinkers was a man named Parmenides. In many ways, he is the anti-Heraclitus. Whereas Heraclitus saw the world as constant change and flux, Parmenides saw it as stable and whole. Everything is the unchanging one. It's not the easiest concept to get a hold of, but maybe the best way of understanding it is to understand their arguments against the alternative, that the world is in fact not an unchanging one. Zeno, a pupil of Parmenides, came up with several paradoxes to explain how the idea of change and motion is mostly an illusion. Say you have an arrow which needs to reach a target 100 yards away. Before it goes the full distance, the arrow must go at least half of that distance. But before the arrow can go 50 yards, it must first reach half of that, which is 25 yards. But to get to 25 yards, the arrow must reach half of that. A similar argument is used in the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. Say you have a race between the quick Achilles and the lumbering tortoise. To make it fair, you handicap the race and let the tortoise begin halfway to the goal. Each moment of time that passes has the faster Achilles getting closer to the tortoise, but by the time Achilles reaches where the turtle began, the turtle makes an incremental increase. Once the quicker Achilles reaches the tortoise's next point, the turtle also experienced an incremental increase in distance. Therefore, Achilles may never pass the tortoise. But a wise man once said, "Don't explain anything further if you can let Meg Ryan do it for you." Which brings us to this episode's movie moment.
And now for our feature presentation.
Unless you're a buff on random romantic comedies, you probably don't remember the movie IQ. The film is literally about a time-traveling Einstein matchmaking a doctoral student with a mechanic. Oh, the 90s. The flirtatious Meg Ryan woos the supposedly genius Tim Robbins with Zeno's paradox.
Now don't tell me that a famous and brilliant scientist such as yourself doesn't know about Zeno's paradox.
Remind me.
You can't get from there to here because you always have to cover half the remaining distance. Like from me to you, I have to cover half of it. But see, I still have half of that remaining, so I cover half that. And there's still half of that left, so I cover half that. that, and half of that, and half of that, and half of that, and since there are infinite halves left, can't ever get there.
Like Meg Ryan, Zeno didn't honestly believe that you couldn't travel from point A to point B, only that our explanations for it are flawed. You can imagine Zeno was all the rage at dinner parties. The paradox philosopher was quite the character. He was ultimately put to death for conspiring against the tyrant Nearchus. According to myth, Zeno was tortured to give up names of his fellow conspirators. Not only did he refuse to reveal their names, but he did ask for Nearchus to come closer to hear a different secret. When the tyrant was near, Zeno pulled a Mike Tyson and bit the tyrant's ear off.
What happened here? He got bit, I think.
According to sources, Zeno did not let go until he lost his life and the tyrant lost part of his body. Zeno was an absolute legend, but there is only one who can wear the crown of this episode's Philosopher King. This goes to the father of modern science, the laughing philosopher himself, Democritus. There's a lot to like about Democritus. All in all, he was a cheery man, frequently portrayed as smiling and laughing. But he did have one huge idea that was nothing to laugh at. His early theory of the atom would prove very influential. Just listen to the points he made and how closely they mirror the thinking today in modern science. The world is made up of atoms and kinds of atoms. These atoms are in motion, clashing and combining with one another to make larger objects. For him, even the gods are made out of atoms. And these atoms behave mechanistically, like a machine or a clock. And it's not the atoms which have qualities we perceive, like color and smell. It's only in our experience that we perceive those qualities. Alright, so this is an embarrassing admission. And I promise, despite it sounding totally made up, it is 100% true. When I was younger, much younger, I remember my older sister first learning about atoms, and she mentioned them to me in passing, and I was just so blown away and confused by this notion. You see, I had thought that the word atoms was actually the word Adams, like the family surname Adams. So I had thought that the world was literally composed of these microscopic people in a family known as Adamses. So this was the beginning of my very illustrious philosophical career, as you could see, and I'm sure Democritus would have had a good laugh at it. We've just barely scratched the surface of pre-Socratic thinkers, but we only have so much time. To help us go through as much content as possible, let's jump right into this episode's rapid fire segment. Rapid fire. We cover as much philosophy as we can in the time allotted. Counter set? Go! There was another big Ionian thinker, Xenophanes. He thought it was unwise to anthropomorphize the gods. If there are gods, they probably aren't like us. Another guy named Empedocles tried to resolve the contradictions of the one in the many with saying a different combination of the one explains differences in the world. This is close to Anaximander, who developed the concept of nous, or a cosmic mind which orders the world. Then there's this guy who wasn't anti-Pythagoras, but pro-Pythagoras. He argued for a type of relativism, saying man is the measure of all things. He was one of many in a school known today as the Sophist, a group of people who went around teaching how to argue and oftentimes were kinda jerks. The Pre-Socratics redefined thinking. As we continue on the timeline, you'll notice how the ideas presented here come back again and again. philosophy has a way of building on top of and reinventing previous ideas. Because of this, it's always important to keep these thinkers in mind, even if they pooped in weird places. But they are called Pre-Socratics for a reason, and that's because no matter how big of a deal these guys are, they still pale in comparison to the group of thinkers that come after them. In the next episode, we'll cover some of these big names you've definitely heard of, like Plato and Aristotle, and see what all the hype is about. I promise I'll try to keep the poop jokes at a minimum, too.